Wednesday afternoon, stroke evening, to wrestle with this really knotty topic. As Sarah said, I've been wrestling with this for a while now, first of all through my PhD, which was largely looking at how an institution like the Church of England has been dealing with capitalism, both in theory and in practice. And I wrote that and I thought, well, no one reads PhDs really, do they? I produced a monograph that I'm sure is in a dusty corner of a library somewhere still. So I wrote the Toxic Assumptions book, which is this one, which was designed to be a sort of cashing out of what I had discovered in those travels about some of the rottenness at the core of the very old-fashioned rules there are behind what we all experience as capitalism in our day-to-day lives. And I noticed 7 toxic assumptions ranging from things like the invisible hand and competition to thinking about pricing and models of ownership that we have in the marketplace. But again, some people felt that it was still a bit too theoretical looking at the system as a whole. So SEM came over and said, well, look, can you write something a bit more practical about what to actually do to try and sort out capitalism? So I wrote this book called Buying God, which is more squarely about consumerism. And that's really what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. But this is so that you know that there are other resources if you want to go a bit deeper into this, stretching all the way back to that ghastly monograph, but ending up with Buying God, which is a bit more practical and has got lots of resources at the back. I'd also highly commend Sarah's website to you, JustMoney, because there are so many really useful resources there which will back up a lot of the calls to action that will come out of this evening. So I wanted to start by just saying a little bit about the techniques of consumerism. I think it's the sort of sea in which we swim, so sometimes it's hard to kind of spot what's going on. But it's really rather simple. It's all about novelty. So something new is invented or created or designed and becomes apparent through often advertising or your mates acquiring them or wearing them or social media sites or pings on your phone. And we desire novelty. We're very keen on novelty. We're particularly keen on novelty when people we admire have acquired this novelty, or we want to get one over on those who may not yet have been able to acquire it. This is not news, it's René Girard's mimetic desire, of course. But again, a lot of research into vervet monkeys about serotonin levels to do with us wanting to be on top. So the second a new thing comes out, we want it. And the advertising has got so incredibly sophisticated, it sort of seduces us into thinking that if we only acquire this new thing, we will suddenly be perfect. We will be complete, we'll be cool, we'll be acceptable, all of those lovely things. So we trot off with our hard-earned cash and we purchase this thing and we get it home and then nothing happens. We sort of maybe feel excited for a few minutes when we trot around on new trainers or brag about our latest whatever it is we've got. But then everyone's got one, so it's not new anymore. And then there's another advert for another new thing and you think, oh, how cool I will be if only I have that thing. So it's this really ghastly kind of death spiral of us desperately trying to kind of stay on top and be fabulous and attractive and acceptable and wonderful, and the market being perfectly willing to keep feeding us those kinds of aspirational things. And of course the market only works if things become obsolete rather quickly and things get old. So there'll always be newness and there'll always be purchases. So why do we do this? Well, Peter Sedgwick, lovely theologian, argues that it's actually about self-identity. The reason that we consume in the way that we do is to explain who we are, to differentiate who we are, to say who we're with, all those kinds of things. And again, you could date this back to the Garden of Eden. The second you give people fig leaves, they're going to start mucking about who's got the best fig leaves and, you know, are yours autumnal, are they large, are they small? You know, the second you have more than one person in the room, there will be displays taking place and people using objects and dress and accessories to say something about who they think they are. And of course, we are creatures of desire. And the market knows this, which is why it's so incredibly successful and consumerism is such an overweening power. But of course, we're creatures of desire because God made us to be. And the problem with consumerism is it is surfing on a wave of theology that it is not understanding and cannot satisfy. So Rowan Williams is brilliant on this. He says that there's this sort of idea that there's a hole that could be filled. You know, that if only we acquire the right thing, that will fill the gap and we'll be finally complete. But if you remember that collect about our souls are restless until they find their rest in thee, the mystic Thomas Traherne was brilliant at this. He wrote this wonderful thing. It is of the nobility of men's soul that he is insatiable. Do not your inclinations tell you that the world is yours? Do you not covet it at all? So I don't think it's that anyone ever thinks we would ever stop desiring. It's not who we are supposed to be, because we are supposed to be searching our way back to God, because the second a creator creates you, there is a degree of alienation because you've been spun out. And our life's goal is to reintegrate with God on some level. So there is this unending desire that Rowan Williams says we just need to grow up about. We just need to realise that's human nature, that's how we're made. And we should not expect anything on earth to satisfy us because it can't. So that's the first thing about consumerism, is to say no. No amount of Nike trainers and fabulousness will ever make me complete, because only God can do that. And that's quite a tricky thing, because of course consumerism knows this is about self-identity, so increasingly it's all about superstars and cool people and social media and TikTok showing you the tribes you could be part of if only you display these brands. And as we know from the thrall it holds teenagers in, it's very, very difficult when you're searching for your identity not to have these proxies where you think, if I have the right kinds of brands in the playground or in the coffee shop, then suddenly I will be acceptable in a way that we all want to be. So I worry that the church has missed a massive trick here, because we invented all this stuff, really. We know about desire, it's our gig. So why are we letting capitalism take that off us and sell this very empty narrative that if you buy stuff, you will be fixed? Because we just know that that is theologically nonsense. So that's my kind of starting point, which is that we need to notice that there is a big tractor beam trying to take us off course. And we need to work out how we can be strong enough to notice that and not to be enthralled to it. And we also need to figure out how we could strengthen those around us who might be more vulnerable to those sorts of inducements, not to feel taken in by this idea that something they can buy in a shop could fix them. And this is where the church has an incredibly important role to play, about being a place where people can find a self-identity, they can feel accepted and loved and wanted, and then they won't need to find their salvation in a mall. And that is something I think that we need to take rather more seriously than we have been doing. So what do we do about it? I mean, there's a lot of sort of muscular virtue ethics style activity you can do on your own to try and figure out, do I really need that? You know, all these narratives about enoughness, where you're shopping, all those kinds of things. But is there a sort of practical way to address that? Well, there's lots of stuff, both on the website, the Just Money website, but also in my book about things you can do. But it all boils down to taking very, very seriously your personal contribution to the kind of market you're creating around you. Now, my inspiration for this is the theologian Tim Gorringe, who pointed out that the market is really just messages of supply and demand. And the reason the market's become skewed in favour of the rich and famous is because they essentially have more votes in the marketplace than poor people do, because they have more money. So the more you can have demand for you know, tax havens and £1 million handbags, the more the market will supply those to you. If there isn't a call for cheap antivirals and fresh water, then that won't be something the market provides. So there's a very interesting question for us on the back of that about solidarity, you know, who isn't able to vote in the marketplace and how can we do that for them? But also, what are we doing around our votes? Who are we voting for? So my quick way into that is to think about turning up at the gates of heaven, and St. Peter wants to check out your economic credentials. And where would you go for a kind of report card on this? What would you look at to see about your economic citizenship? And I think one of the quickest ways to get to the heart of this is to look at a bank statement. So I've got mine here. I'm on sabbatical at the moment, so I've picked one from when I was earning, so it's got a normal pattern of behaviour. But the thing about bank statements is they arrive every month, and you tend to just file them or whatever, look at them in horror, I don't know. But what I want you to do is get obsessed with your bank statement. I want you first of all, though, to think about who you'd be happy to share it with. That's quite an interesting acid test. Would you show it to your mum? Would you show it to your boss? Would you show it to your vicar? Would you show it to your spouse? Would you show it to your kids? Who wouldn't you show it to, and why? Because that is a really quick way of getting to the heart of what you feel worried about in terms of how you are exercising votes in the marketplace. So when you have fished out your bank statement, if you can bear it, what I think we all need to do to make the market more kingdom shaped is turn every single transaction on that bank statement into being a vote for the kingdom. And that requires quite a lot of Googling, because there'll be all kinds of transactions where you just wave your card in front of the thing and you trot out the shop and you don't really think twice. But when you start Googling that shop and you start seeing things about the supply chain, things about their record on payment of tax, when you start looking at employment disputes, when you start looking at citizenship around ESG or anything to do with their green credentials, it starts making you a bit more attuned to who are the bad guys and who are the good guys. Now, I think it's unreasonable to expect you'll ever have an entirely clean report card on this, because we're living in a fallen world. But there's something about an aspiration, which is to try and turn all those transactions on your bank statement to green. So what I tend to do with mine, you can probably see a little bit here, I've got a few slightly sort of tatty highlighter pen marks. So I try and do red, amber, green on mine, and I go through and I have a look at the transactions I feel are a bit dodgy. So here I've got Accessorize. Now Accessorize is a really fun shop, isn't it, when you're trotting around the station and you're a bit bored, and I had to buy a hat for a wedding, so I rushed in there to buy one, and then straight into another shop in the railway station next door to buy something to pop on it, a flower shop, I think. But both of those are sort of PLCs, more interested in shareholder value than anything else, not entirely okay around supply chain and sourcing, although I think they are trying. So I've kind of given myself a rap over the knuckles for that, because there are often quite a lot of purchases where you're just in a bit of a hurry, aren't you? And you kind of rush to the nearest place because it's convenient. And the thing is, it's not convenient being green in your shopping and being sensible in your shopping. Often you have to walk a bit further and pay slightly more. But of course, if something's cheap, someone's paying. So it's always interesting to think about who is bearing the cost for you. I've got some greens for, I did a staff collection for someone leaving. I did some public transport in London. There's a PayPal transaction here. I'm a bit cross with PayPal. I don't think they're particularly brilliant either. But on the other hand, PayPal are enabling a huge number of people to create shop fronts through eBay and other places where they would not be able to trade otherwise. So I think, you know, there is some work to be done on their corporate structuring, but that was particularly PayPal for my Patreon account. I don't know if you know about Patreon. It's where you can support people and causes that you care about. And that's a really good proactive way to find people or organisations in the marketplace you want to support and voluntarily subscribe to keeping them going. I've given myself an amber for Marks and Spencer's because they are trying very hard with their no plan B and with their sourcing. But again, I'll talk about shopping locally because that would be a preference really. And I've given myself a red for supermarkets. And again, supermarkets, we'll all have to use supermarkets, won't we? But the idea is to try and use them as little as possible. Because yes, they do incredibly brilliant things around apprenticeships and employment and opportunity. But they also do not always treat their suppliers well. And that can be a real problem. I've got some greens for shopping locally and lots of greens for charity shops. I discovered, as the scourge of capitalism, one of my problems is I'm quite addicted to shopping. So I've transformed that into an addiction to charity shops, because then it's all going to charity. And if I make a disastrous purchase, I can just take it back again and that's a donation. So that's great. I went to the museums and galleries, so they get a green. Another chain, Benugo in London. A famous pie shop in North Berwick, that was local, so that's okay. There's some more charity shops, all bar one in Edinburgh. Bernardo's again, that's good. Local wine shop, obviously great. All Marks and Spencer's again. But you can see, the pub, you should definitely support pubs because otherwise they'll close, and they're one of the only places that the class is mixed these days, so we must support them like mad because they're important for the community. Yes, and my pay, that was when I was working for the Royal Society of Edinburgh, so I feel pleased about that because this is not only about your expenditure, it's also about where are you taking money in from. If you're getting a pension paid in, or you're getting investment income, do you know how that's invested? Have you given a mandate to make sure they're not investing in companies you don't approve of, like fossil fuels or something like that? And how much control have you got over that? Because it's very easy to change mandates these days. Now, this isn't the account that our utilities are paid from, but again, on a normal bank statement, you might have your utilities in there. There are loads of great tools to search through and find out where are the best utilities in terms of ecological footprint and ethical practices. So it is worth not doing it all now because you can't change, build Rome in a day, or the kingdom even. But there is something about trying to just gradually ratchet up these transactions to try and turn the red to amber and then turn the amber to green. And you may, by circumstance, have a few reds on there, but it's about just trying to change that balance so that they're not all red, and just be curious about it. And from time to time, go back and think, what else could I have done there? Is there another habit I could build into my daily route or my patterns that would give me access to something that would be a more ethical way to put my votes into the market? So I said I was going to say something about local shops. We hear quite a lot about how it's good to shop locally, but there is a bit of science behind this. There's a lovely video that I think Sarah has somewhere on her website, which is a wee boy in Orkney going shopping, and he explains this very beautifully, so do watch that. But this is some research that was done by the New Economics Foundation, and they had this idea that they wanted to know where money was spent. Is it spent? Does it kind of end, or does it travel? And they wanted to understand how money travels. So they imagined that everyone in a community has got, they've been at, soft play, or they've been at sort of messy church, and they've got blue hands for all the paint. And they wanted to see how much blue paint you could get on a pound coin, depending on where you spent it. So they did all this analysis to understand where the pound goes once you've spent it. And they discovered that if you spend it in a big chain, like one of the big supermarkets, then it doesn't really have very much effect locally. They say the pound that's spent in a chain is worth 36p to the local economy, because apart from a halo effect on some local wages, most of the profits go down south, go offshore, go somewhere else. But they found that if your pound stays local, it ends up being worth £1.76 to the local community. And that's because of this. So you maybe pop into a local cafe to get your coffee before work, and you give them the pound, and then you rush off to work. They've got this pound and there's a bit of a lull, and they need to get some more milk. So they pop round the corner to the local shop to get some milk and exchange the pound. And that corner shop sells stamps, and they've run out. So they rush off to the post office to buy some more stamps for your pound. And they go to the post office and they pay the pound over to get these stamps. And the post office then gives that pound out to someone who's come in to collect their pension, if you're allowed to do that in cash these days. And then they go off and treat themselves to the hairdressers. And then the hairdresser, wants a coffee. So they go to the local shop and have coffee. And so you can see there's a sort of circulation going on. And in fact, when this research came out, the New Economics Foundation, there were a lot of councils who decided that the best thing they could do was to decide to source locally. So instead of going for the cheapest provider for things, if they were based elsewhere, was to try and have a presumption in favour of using local suppliers and paying them promptly in order to keep this money circulating in this way, because then it becomes a currency in the local market and, has a huge impact on the local economy. So You won't always be able to shop locally. There will be all kinds of circumstances in your life that mean that you need to shop online and shop in chains from time to time. But the idea is that if you understand what you're doing with your votes, then you can be elegant about them, and you can offset. So if you do have to make some purchases which would be in the red category, then you make sure that month you're doing lots of other ones. So I used to go to church just off the King's Road, and there was a wonderful flower stall halfway down, and what would happen is you'd be hurrying off to church and you'd go past this flower stall, and it was so beautiful, and you'd stand for a moment and look at all this glorious stuff, the daffodils and the lilies and all these lovely things. You think, that reminds me, I must get flowers for my mum, I'll pop into Waitrose after church. And of course the problem is, if you don't use that flower stall, you lose that flower stall. And that's, of course, what we found happening on the high streets up and down the country, is that there are all kinds of cheaper ways to do things. And there is a huge pressure on everyone at the moment in terms of how we spend our money. And it does take often more time and effort to do the right thing. But it is worth thinking about the use it or lose it idea. So I was once on a holiday in Cape Cod, and they had a really lovely local initiative in their church. They had a little card in the pew, and they asked you to pledge to spend $50, adjust the amount for you, on 3 different local organisations that you wanted to support proactively, that you wanted to keep in the community, the fishmonger or the hairdresser or whatever it might be, local bookshop. And they wanted you to pledge to spend $50 every month just to keep them going, because if people don't, as a practice, keep using their local shops, then they do end up not making enough money to be able to keep going. So that might be another thing, apart from manoeuvres like Patreon, which is to invest your money in proactively supporting particular causes, is to think about which institutions do you really love having around you in your community, and what are you doing to look after their maintenance and their welfare, day to day, month to month, rather than just when you need them, which may be seldom, but they may not be there when you do. So I'm going to pause in a minute, because I've been nattering on now for a good 20 minutes or so. But I wanted to just say a little bit about how this works, the whole being salt and light thing. Because it can feel a bit like, oh crikey, I'm sitting here with my bank statement and my red, amber, green, and will it make a difference, and is it all worth it, and is it all a bit too hard? I wanted to just share some game theory with you on this, which I'm sure Jesus would approve of, because he was the one that came up with salt and light, and this rather proves him right. And it's about a very interesting book that I read. It's by Robert Axelrod, and it's called The Evolution of Cooperation. And I read it when I was still a little management consultant at Deloitte, and it was doing the rounds. It's got my old stickers in it from my old addresses in here. And it's a story of a set of computer programs that were created to try and understand how would you program the best sort of strategy to win a basic mathematical game. So they used the prisoner's dilemma, which is a real classic. It's supposed to be about 2 people who've both been nicked. They're in separate questioning rooms, and they have to decide whether to grass or not. And whether they grass or not depends on, whether they both go down or neither of them go down, all that kind of thing. And it's used as one of these kind of archetypal interactions that could pertain to global warfare or sharing of resources or competition strategy or anything. And all these mathematicians then fire kind of strategies at them to see if there's a way to win. So Robert Axelrod writes up this wonderful tournament they had with all these games they'd invited, and they'd invited tacticians and mathematicians and chess players and computer whiz kids and all kinds of people to come up with cunning manoeuvres they thought would beat the other games at this strategy to win the prisoner's dilemma. And of all the games, there was one called tit for tat, which won. And they played it off against all the other games, and then they did lots of iterations over time to see if that changed over time. And tit for tat was what they'd call a nice game. So the rules for tit for tat were that you generally are lovely all the time to everyone, you cooperate, but if they're naughty, you punish them once and then you go back to be nice again. So if they defect, you defect, but then as soon as they come back, you go back to being cooperative again. So it's a very sort of slappy wristy once and then recover. But generally, apart from that, it is a nice game. And they were surprised because all these devious, sneaky, Machiavellian games didn't win. And this very, very nice tit-for-tat game did. And more than that, they established by this kind of iterative community of game playing that they established, that something interesting happened when tit-for-tat won, because it started changing the behaviour of the games around it, because it was creating an environment where it was a very simple rule to follow. You punish once and then you keep being nice. That's your default strategy. And there were enough games that kind of caught on to this as a strategy that over time, niceness prevailed. So this is what I mean by salt and light, because they found that only 5% of the game players needed to be nice for the entire community to be transformed over time. Because the 5% would play each other, they would create oceans of beauty around them, and that would end up converting the entire shebang to a community of nice game players. So that's the game theory behind salt and light, which is that you might feel you're just the 5% and you're spending a lot of time yourselves being good. But look what we did with fair trade. You know, we created a whole category from nothing. We were all overpaying, paying the premium because we believed it, we understood that. And, you know, now you can't go into a coffee shop without it being fair trade. That wasn't even a category before the church started engaging with that. So there are lots of things that we know we can do. We just need to be brave, and we need to start, and we need to be assured that we're in good company and that salt and light will prevail, because we know that that is the only way to go forward.